On this episode of the Salesman Podcast, you're going to learn how storytelling can make you more money. Hello, Sales Nation, and welcome to today's episode of the Salesman Podcast. On today's show, we have Paul Smith. He's a storytelling expert within the context of business, sales, parenting, and other verticals. And on today's show, he's sharing how we can implement stories to differentiate ourselves from the competition and essentially win more business. Everything we talk about is in the show notes of this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com. And with all that said, let's jump right in. Hi, Paul, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Hey, Will, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you on, mate. I'm excited to dive into stories, and hopefully we can get some practical examples and some real key takeaways for the audience here, because clearly they're underutilized in business and sales, and clearly they're super powerful. So we've covered the structure of stories, sales stories, business stories in the past. So I don't want to gloss over that, but we can perhaps somewhat skip that step, and I want to dive into practical examples. And I'll link to some previous episodes in the show notes as well. And if we tee up Sam, the salesperson, who's he's this imaginary character, is making an impact in a lot of these episodes recently to try and make the show more practical and engaging for the audience. So let's talk about Sam. He is somewhat successful. He's in, say, software sales, for example, and he's using stories day to day, but he's not consciously writing them out, planning them, strategically using them is perhaps the best way to describe it. So for him to have an impact with stories in sales and business, where's the first place he should start?
Yeah, great question. So I think the first place anybody should start is with recognizing that storytelling is a skill set that would behoove them to work on. So, because, a lot of people just think, well, some people are natural born storytellers and others aren't. And if you're not, well, you're just never going to be one. And I don't buy that at all. I think storytelling is like music or art. Of course, some people are going to be naturally born with more giftedness in those areas than others. And I, by the way, I'm not one of those people. So I have no musical talent, or artistic talent whatsoever. but I'm convinced if I wanted to learn how to play the guitar, I could learn it in a few months, and to some rudiments of it. And what I would do is I would go, hire a trainer, or go take a class, or read a book, or watch a video. I would go intentionally learn it, right, from somebody who knows how. And storytelling is the same way. Yeah, you may not be a naturally gifted storyteller, but you can learn it. You can learn it well enough. And so that's the first thing. I think the second thing that follows very quickly onto that, though, is knowing which stories you need to tell, right? So I think a lot of salespeople have one or two or three kind of go-to stories they have for the product or service that they're selling. But one of the surprising things I found in the research for my last book was the breadth of stories that great salespeople have. And I was really surprised. In fact, I probably interviewed professional sales and procurement managers at over 50 companies around the world. So both salespeople and professional buyers too. And by the way, adding those buyers in there wasn't just a lark. In fact, at the end, I'm convinced I learned more from the buyers than I did the salespeople, because who better to tell you which sales stories work and which ones don't than the professional buyers who do nothing all day long but listen to salespeople tell their stories, and decide which ones to buy from and which ones not to. But the first surprise I had was the sheer number of stories that great salespeople have. And it was all across the sales process, right? Everywhere from the moment they introduce themselves to the buyer to preparing themselves for the sales call, like stories they tell themselves, by the way, not other people, to building rapport with the buyer, to making the actual sales pitch itself, to handling objections during that sales pitch, to closing the sale, even service after the sale, managing the customer relationship after the sale. Great salespeople were telling stories throughout that entire process. And I would have thought it would have just been, one or two, key places. And at the end of doing the research for the book, I ended up documenting 25 different types of stories that I think every salesperson needs to be able to tell. And that's just more than I expected. And so that, I think, is very quickly behind knowing that storytelling is something you can learn, is knowing which stories you need to tell. That's really the first couple of steps.
Amazing. So there's about 5 points to go through here. So because I could talk about this all day, it's something that I really enjoy talking about because it's also applicable outside of sales, just communicating in general. And so these topics really excite me. First point of all of this is when we say a natural born storyteller. Clearly, there's naturally born salespeople. There's natural born athletes, which is perhaps different because maybe there's a genetic element to that versus the nature nurture argument. What makes up a great natural storyteller? And what I mean by that is, or the reason for asking that is, what traits within that, before we get onto the stories themselves, which will be the meat and potatoes of this interview, what traits of a naturally great storyteller do we need to know so that we can then emulate, so we can catch up to speed with them?
Great question. So one would just be somebody who's comfortable in their own skin telling stories, right? That's the first thing you notice about somebody when they're obviously not a good storyteller is that they get nervous when they shift in the conversation from just talking to telling a story when they weren't nervous 30 seconds ago, but now they are. And they stutter and stammer around and talk about the story in third person like it's this big behemoth in the room. And, so let me just tell you a story, okay? Well, so I'm just going to tell you. Well, let me just start. So see, it's back. Well, it's about me, see, and it happened, well, it was a while ago. Well, let me just go ahead and start, and they just can't get started. And it's so awkward. And because they're thinking so much about the story that they just don't tell it. Gifted storytellers just start telling the story. They don't give you any preamble. They just start telling the story. Their tone of voice doesn't change. It was conversational before they started telling the story. It's conversational after they started telling the story. And great storytellers know when to stop. I mean, one of the interesting things I found out in doing the research for this book, and I've probably documented in the 300 or so people I've interviewed, and I've gotten 8 to 12 stories from each person. So do the math there. I've documented over 2,000 different stories. The average leadership story is about 5 minutes long. The average sales story is 2 minutes long. Okay, 2 minutes. Right? It's not 5. It's not 10. It's not 15. It's not 20. Naturally gifted storytellers know when to stop. They know how to tell a short, powerful, impactful story and then move on, as opposed to this long, rambling thing that nobody wants to hear. So there's 2 or 3 character traits for you right there.
Amazing. And just on this rambling, because this is something I wanted to bring up and a question I wanted to ask, even personally as well, because I do it sometimes. You'll probably see it in the next 20 minutes on the show of I'll tell an anecdote. And I know the structure of a good anecdote, and very super basically beginning, middle, end, or the hero's journey kind of structure. And I think I'm going to answer my own question here, but a lot of the time on the show I'm processing it and I'm recreating it in my mind as I'm telling it. Is that the problem of why it's rambling? In that the sales process is very similar in most sales. The customer's going to be different. There's going to be different elements of the product. There's going to be different priorities, but the process is somewhat similar. So should we be eliminating some of this rambling by having a story almost verbatim and ready to go, as in pre-preparing it before a meeting or pre-preparing it for our sales process and then using it over and over and over? Or should we be trying to come up with these stories in the moment and add them in when it's super organically? Or is that an excuse for just not preparing?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you perhaps a strange answer, but it's a little bit of both. What you definitely want to prepare, so no excuses for not preparing. You should know what your 25 stories are for each part of the sales process, and you should know, I guess, meaning memorized the basic structure of the story. In fact, when I coach people, I tell them don't write your stories out word for word, because you'll be tempted to memorize them. And one of the things I learned from the buyers that I interviewed for this latest book was that one of the things that makes, in fact, I asked them this question: what is it that makes a sales pitch sound like a sales pitch? And I wanted to know that because they all told me that as soon as they could tell that the sales pitch had started, the hairs on the back of their neck just, stand up, and they immediately get, defensive. And you don't want that. You want it to sound authentic and genuine and organic. But the way to make it sound authentic, genuine, and organic isn't to completely make it up on the spot, or because you'll end up just rambling around and not knowing where you're going with it. The way to do it is to remember the key bullet points of the story, the facts in the right order, but don't memorize the full sentences that you will use to describe it. That way, every time you tell the story, much of it will be organic and improvised right on the spot because you've never memorized a script. You've just remembered the basic outline of the story. And the basic outline will help you tell it in 2 minutes or less, so you're not rambling, but the exact words will be a little bit different every time. So it will sound organic and unscripted because it is unscripted, but it's not totally fabricated on the spot. So it's a combination of both of those things that I think yields the best result.
So I want to come back onto the buyer's perspective on this because that's something that we've covered storytelling in business a whole bunch of times, and that's something unique to yourself, Paul, and that's something that we've not talked about before. So I really want to double down on that in a second. But when we'll if we can get time, we'll cover as many of these 25 stories as we possibly can throughout the sales process. But just to put it in context for us all, is this an afternoon that we spend in the office, or a Sunday afternoon, whatever it is, where we list the steps of the sales process and we come up with 1 or 2 quick anecdotal stories, bullet point them down, and do we need to physically do that? Is that the first step? Is it worth instilling that into the mind of myself and the audience that is a process that we have to go through to become proficient at storytelling in sales?
Yes, I think it is. I think that's a wonderful way to do it, is list out the steps of your sales process, which might be slightly different than what I just said, but in interviewing all these salespeople, most of them are pretty similar. And yes, identify what are the 1 or 2 stories in each of these steps that will help you. And it may be an afternoon for you, it may be an hour, it may be a week-long process. I don't know what it will take for each person, but having that written down, I mean, take it seriously. Like you would never, if your boss asked you to do some analysis, and write a report and send it in, would you just like scribble down a few things and send it in, without doing any research or work? Of course not. So these stories are going to be some of your greatest sales assets. Take them seriously. Do the research. I mean, you might have to talk to some other people, interview other people. If other people were involved in the story that you want to use, it's not something that happened to you personally, you're going to have to do some research about it. You don't have to talk to the company historian or the person that's been working at the company the longest of anybody, or the CEO, or other of your sales comrades, to find out what happened and get the details right and be able to answer all the questions in your story structure. So yeah, it takes some work, but anything worthwhile does.
I love the way you use asset there, in that maybe it needs updating occasionally, but once you've done it, it is even a physical document that you can take with you. And what I also like about all this is it ties into people coming on the show quite regularly as I hate the term, but as social selling is kind of in the news and it's the exciting thing in the world of sales at the moment. People are talking about you've got to have a blog, or you've got to connect with people on LinkedIn and share insights. This is still content, but you're just giving it verbally on a one-on-one connection versus it's something that you're going to write out and share and put on a blog post that no one's ever going to see. So keeping it in our minds as an asset, as a piece of content, I think is really valuable in this. But coming to the buyer, what the heck do buyers want story-wise? Because the rest of the conversation is essentially mute, isn't it? The whole point of everything that we're doing here is to, assuming that we've got the right product and the right buyer and the right fit. Everything else that we're doing is just to make them happy, build trust, and to put our product, kind of lubricate the process of getting our product in front of them. So what do they care about within a story, and then just in a conversation as well? Because clearly the bits either side of this that are teeing up the anecdote or the story and then wrapping up and asking for that next action are all entwined.
There was an interesting study done by, I think it was Forrester Research a number of years ago, and they asked professional buyers, like 1,000 different professional buyers, different companies, in what ways were the salespeople that called on them prepared for a sales call? And the options in the answer, the multiple choice answer was they're, very knowledgeable about the product they're selling. They're very knowledgeable about their industry. One of the options was they're knowledgeable about my industry, the buyer's industry. And they got various scores on that. And it's not surprising that they thought salespeople were most prepared with the knowledge about the product they're selling and the industry they work in, a little bit less prepared in understanding the buyer's industry and their business. But the lowest score in this survey question was, is prepared with enough anecdotes, stories, and examples to help me understand how this product will really work inside my, doors. And so they are telling you that you need more stories. You've got plenty of sales pitch when you walk in the door. You don't have enough stories to help me really understand how this will affect me and my business personally. So that's
and
the thing.
Paul, let me just stop on this a second.
Yeah.
And tell me if I'm right or wrong here, but is that because salespeople are very likely to memorize a bunch of figures of 75% of the market use our product, blah, 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 blah. And is that harder? It seems so simple, but I want to verbalize it because it's something that I've not done very well in the past. I was very, in medical device sales, very focused on figures, facts, because I thought that is open to less interpretation and so easier to understand, but I don't think it's the case in hindsight. Are stories useful in these scenarios because it paints a picture in the mind of the buyer and it allows them to process this information rather than just see it?
Yes, I think all the questions that you just asked. Yes, salespeople are typically prepared with all the facts and figures and features and benefits, and that's what they're selling is features and benefits, and so they've got all that memorized. And I'm not suggesting they shouldn't have that. Of course, you need all of that if you're going to sell something. So I'm not suggesting storytelling to replace the typical type of facts and features and benefits and logical arguments that you make in a sales call at all. I'm talking about storytelling as an additional skill set to bring to, that entire sales process. And I think you probably only ought to be doing storytelling 10 or 15% of the time that you're talking ought to be in the form of a story. 85, 90% ought to be just normal expository, logical, rational conversation. But that last 10 or 15% can be very powerful.
So let me just ask you this then. How does this, and we might be overanalyzing it here, so tell me if you think we are. Does the story then fit in of you have a fact, so 75% of people use our product within your vertical, and then you say, and Mr. blah, 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 who is your biggest competitor, then you start telling the story. Can it be structured as fact, then story to make the fact real? Is that the process? That
is definitely one way to use stories as an illustration or an example of a fact that you just stated. But it can also be used, and one of your questions was, what stories do buyers want to hear? So I asked that question. And one of the things that they said was, I want to hear stories about your product in use, either at my competitors or some of your best clients, so I can see how they're using it, so I'll know if that will work for me. But the other types of stories they were asking for was they want to know how your company was founded. How did you get started? Right? Because nobody ever quit their day job and risked everything to start a business for a boring reason. Right? That's never happened in the history of mankind. There's always an exciting story behind why somebody would take all that risk and go start a business. Buyers want to know that because it tells them who you are as a company, not as a salesperson, but who your company is, and stories to help them understand your values. They want to know, how honestly are you going to deal with me, and stories about your integrity and wherein you've demonstrated it before help them get a feel for that. But most of them are stories about your product and other people who've used your product or people that didn't use your product and wish they had. Those kind of stories make it real and concrete as opposed to a nebulous list of features and benefits that is hard to wrap their mind around.
You just said something here which I think is really important, and I don't want to gloss over it, and that is that they want to hear about the company and how it's founded, or the values and things of that nature. Because most sales trainers would tell you they don't really care about you, the company, the product, the service. They only care selfishly about them, which is clearly somewhat true. You perhaps have your foot in the door and you're having a conversation. You've added value, given insights, you've done whatever it is to make them want to have a conversation, and perhaps the company founder story and the values of the company comes later on in the process. But that is a really unique insight that unless you've interviewed these buyers, it'd probably be quite difficult to uncover. And that's totally contrarian to what other people come on the show and said. So I'm really interested in that. Is there any specifics, or is there any place in the sales process where that comes up and has the biggest impact? The
stories about your company, your company's founding, your company's values, why you do what you do, things like that are all part of what I call the building rapport. So this is before you get to the main sales pitch, if you have this opportunity. And sometimes a lot of people have 6-month sales cycles, right? Between the time they meet the prospect to the time they're actually closing the sale, could be 6 or 9 months, and is going to have maybe a half dozen or a dozen different touch points where you actually have a conversation with the prospect. So you have lots of opportunities to tell stories. And those that we just mentioned are more often in the early stage before you're actually making the really, hard sales pitch, or after you've made it the first time, before you've made it for the fourth time, because sometimes it takes that many, right? So it can be often during this and early on. So don't think of these stories as just something that happens during a 30-minute sales pitch. These are stories that you tell long before the sales pitch happens, during the sales pitch, and after the sales pitch is done. You're telling different types of stories.
So, Paul, what are the biggest bang for buck stories, types of stories, or where they fit in the process that perhaps people aren't using? That might be the best way to look at it, so that that'll have the biggest impact on them. Where I'm going with this is, because clearly we don't have time to talk about all 25, and we'll have you back on in the future to cover more of them for sure, because this is fascinating. But what are the, say, 2, 3 that really stand out that will... I want the audience to be able to separate themselves from the competition using stories perhaps in a market with Sam the salesperson, that the product is somewhat commoditized, the pricing is somewhat similar. Like, how can we use sales stories as a tool to separate us, and what are the best ways to go about that?
In order to separate yourself, so the story that does that the most is a story to explain how you're different from your competitors, right? In fact, it's story number 11 in my list of 25 is how we're different from our competitors. So that's definitely a story you need. And the best example I've heard of that was a guy named Sherrod Madison. He's the CEO of UBM, which is United Building Maintenance, which is basically a commercial cleaning company. His company goes in, cleans the offices of companies in big cities, right? And you can imagine how that could be a fairly commoditized business, like you said. And so how can he differentiate himself? So instead of just going in and saying, we use the most modern equipment and I have the best trained, cleaners, or I have the highest paid sales staff, so they really care, or, whatever he has some of that as well. But mostly what he does is he tells a story about what happens when he's acquired a new client. He says, every time, I get a new account, there's somebody I'm replacing, right? It's not like their building is not being cleaned today. They've just, I've convinced them to fire that company and hire mine. And there's usually a 30-day transition period. Well, what I do during the transition period is I go into the buildings at night and watch what they're doing and see how they're cleaning the buildings today. Because the way the contracts typically work is I'm probably going to inherit those workers, just not the management and the ownership and the structure and the machines, but the temporary employees, I'll probably end up having to hire them. And so he'll say, I went into the Verizon building when we acquired it last month, and I watched what they were doing. And here there was this guy out there cleaning this carpet using the kind of carpet cleaner that you'd have for your home, a residential style carpet cleaner. And these carpets are 12 feet wide, and it's a half a mile long just around one floor. And there's 10 floors to the building. It's going to take this guy a week to shampoo the carpets, and it's not going to be very clean because he's literally using the same, Hoover that you've got in your closet at home. So, of course, when we finally took over the contract, I put him in an industrial strength, triple wide, powered, whatever. And, and he'll tell the same story about the person that's vacuuming the carpet, how he puts him in a riding industrial strength one that gets the job done in a single night and gets the guy off of his feet so that you don't have workman's comp issues later, and then he'll say, yeah, and we went into the offices where they're dusting the cabinets. And I looked on top of the cabinets, and there's this half moon swiped out on top of the cabinet. And he said, I know exactly what that means. That means that the people who are cleaning those cabinets aren't tall enough to reach all the way back. So they just reach as far as they can. And that's what leaves the little half moon swiped out. And the other part is dusty. And he said, the truth is they'd be better off not even dusting it, because it's the contrast between the clean part and the dirty part that makes it look so dirty. He said, but I know how to fix that too. He said, and I went and found the people, and I was confirmed. Yeah, some of these people cleaning these offices are less than 5.5 feet tall, and those cabinets are 6 feet tall. They just can't reach. He said, so I give them these little cheap, inexpensive extension wands for their cleaning swabs. Problem solved. So he tells, 2 or 3 short little anecdotes like that about the difference between the way he does business and the way his predecessors do business. And that is so much more effective because I can see it in your eyes right now. You can visualize all of those things happening, right? And that's what you want your audience to do, is to be able to see in their mind's eye the difference, not just hear a logical set of reasons. They need to be able to see it.
What's fascinating is if you put that on a kind of, I don't know, a proposal of, we're going to equip people with slightly longer cleaning brushes and we're going to bring in some newer technology so they can clean the floors. I'd be like, well, great, but that's your job to do that. That's what I'm paying for. That's the expertise that I expect. But when you put it into a story of this gentleman walking around and seeing it
at
and
midnight,
then,
30 days before,
yeah,
right?
And the realization of, I've seen this before. This is a shorter blah, blah, blah. That makes it far more engaging. And I don't know if you were watching me as I was doing it, but I could find I kept seeing myself, and everyone on audio, I'll verbalize so you can see it. But I was, as you were saying, I caught myself looking up into the roof here, because obviously I was visualizing the process of this this really tiny person in a uniform trying to reach on top of these cupboards when there was no way that it was going to happen. So there's a tiny little, it wasn't hilarious, but there's a tiny little bit of humor and setup in that as well, which is fantastic. So clearly that was a great example of a way to drive contrast between you and the competition as well. And you're not necessarily slagging off the competition either. It's very much, that's it's almost saying that's reasonable. That's what people have done in the past, but we are that step ahead, which is fascinating. Okay, so we've got to separate. Okay, go on. If you've got more, go dive straight in.
Yeah, well, so yes, for 2 or 3 of the most powerful types of stories. So that's one that you asked for, was how to differentiate yourself from your competitor. One of the most common types of sales stories that salespeople need to be able to tell is I call it a problem story, and so that's number 13 on my list of 25. You need to be able to tell the story about the quintessential problem that your product or service solves for the buyer. Right, because you said a lot of people come on here and say it all needs to be about the buyer, not about you, and of course I agree with that. All these stories are to help the buyer visualize what you're going to do for them, not what you're going to do for you. So the problem story is one you absolutely got to have, and so one of my favorite examples of that is a guy named Kevin Moulton, and he's a salesperson for an IT type company that does the programs they write are internet and financial transaction security protocols, which is a mouthful for what means is the people that keep your money safe when you're buying something online or getting money out of a cash machine. Okay. All right. So, and so his customers that he calls on, the prospects he calls on, are banks and credit card companies, because they're the ones that need to have all of this security protocol. And in addition to the list of facts and figures and whatever that he has to go in with his typical sales pitch, he almost always tells them a story about a trip he took to Las Vegas. He's a sales guy. He says, so I was at one of these sales conferences in Vegas, and you know how these things are. You go to the conference all day, and then at night, then you go have dinner, and then, you go to the casinos because you're in Vegas, right? So I was out at the casinos, and I was losing some and winning some and then losing more and then losing more. And, eventually I was tapped out of money, but I was still having fun. So it's like 1 o'clock in the morning. And so I went to the cash machine there to put my card in and put in the PIN, and it said transaction denied. And I thought I just got the PIN number wrong. So I put it in again, same thing. Tried a different machine, same thing. So I can't get my money out. And I'm like, okay, I know what's going on. I live in New Jersey. All of a sudden I'm in Las Vegas, Nevada. It's in the middle of the night, and I'm trying to get a ridiculous amount of money out of a cash machine. Okay, the bank obviously thinks somebody stole my credit card and they've shut it down. He said, so I'm not going to get upset about that. I mean, I'm glad they're looking out for me and protecting my money. That's great. What did get him upset, though, he said, was what they did about it. He said, they called my wife in the middle of the night at 4 o'clock in the morning in New Jersey, right? And can you imagine what that half of the conversation would have sounded like? Well, I'm sorry to wake you up, Mrs. Moulton, at 4 o'clock in the morning, but it's 1 a.m. in Las Vegas, and your husband's trying to get a boatload of cash out of a machine at a casino. Do you approve of this transaction? And he said, can you imagine how upset she was and how upset I was that she was upset? And, and he said, it did not take me long to get a new bank and a new credit card after that. And he said, now that kind of thing, I mean, the bank was trying to do something noble and worthwhile, And what they ended up doing was actually getting in the way of me doing legitimate business with them. And worse off, they made my life miserable. My wife wouldn't speak to me for a week, And so he said, this kind of thing probably happens all the time with your customers, and you don't even know it. Okay. If that bank had used my company to do its security protocols, instead of that phone call to my wife happening, they would have simply asked me some security question, or it would have asked me, or they would have called me on my cell phone, which they had the number. Why didn't they call it and ask me if I really meant to get the money out of, So he goes through a list of all the things that they would have done instead of the silly, calling the wife at home. So that story goes a lot farther for him than saying, well, our surveys suggest that 47.6% of your customers are slightly to moderately dissatisfied with their interactions with your bank, or whatever. I mean, that data is nice, but the story makes it come alive and makes it real and visceral and personal about what bad can happen if you don't have my company as, your service provider.
I'm going to give a practical example of this, and then we'll have to wrap up because I'm conscious of time. James Pember has been on the show before. He's the CEO of SpartaSales.com. They sponsored the podcast, and he brought on, positive ROI, great success, and he brought on, in his own words, a new customer from a new area. From I didn't dive too far into it, but I'm assuming from the States, because he's based over here in Europe. And when I'm talking about the sponsorship with potential new sponsors and new people coming on board, I will typically not talk about him, and he's fine for me to talk about him. He's given me permission to use him as an example. And I will typically, rather than talk about him on the phone with people who want to sponsor the show, I will just drop a quote from him, like a reference, essentially, saying exactly what I've just said. We had positive return on investment very quickly, a new customer and a new location. It's great success. It seems to kind of tie the whole conversation together of what we've had so far today, Paul, it seems like I should go and interview him and find out who that customer is, what it meant for him as the buyer of my service, of maybe not even revenue-wise, because that might be somewhat strategic. You might not want to share that particularly, but to get a good sense of what that meant for him. And then that could be a story in itself, especially if it's somewhat of an interesting customer, perhaps, or then his service has helped them in some way, and then that's an even better story. I've got all kinds of neurons firing in my brain as we go through this of examples of ways I can implement it. But am I on the right track here? Is that what I should be doing to take away from this show?
Yeah, absolutely. When I said earlier that you should see your sales assets as assets worthy of being investing in your time of doing research and analysis, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You might need to make a few phone calls to find out the details behind the story. I mean, imagine if every story you ever told was about yourself, was about you. What kind of person would that make you?
I don't know. It's the narcissist or the other kind of one that ties into that for sure.
Exactly. And you don't want to be that kind of person. Nobody wants to do business with somebody who every story out of their mouth is about themselves. Right? I mean, nobody wants to do business with that kind of a narcissist or an egoist, right? So most of your stories need to be about other people. And because they're about other people, you don't have all the details of what happened. Well, guess what? You need to call them and find out. Do some research, do some analysis that goes into your stories, just like you would a report or any other kind of thing that you produce for professional purposes.
Amazing stuff. Well, we're running low on time here. We'll definitely, if you're up for it, we'll have you back on to dive into a few more of these. As you know, them all numbered off by kind of like off by heart. It'd be amazing to dive into more of these and even just rattle through them and just come up with one show that's just 10 or as many as we can fit in. And then I can go back and fill it out, perhaps with a bit of a blog post around it, perhaps to give some more context. And we'll wrap through as many as we can. So I think that'd be really good. But Paul, I've got one final question, mate. It's something that I ask everyone that comes on the show. So I'm going to throw it at you now. And that is, if you personally could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
Oh, well, I mean, for me, I guess it'd be obvious is tell more stories and deliver fewer sales pitches. I guess.
All right, let me just double down on that then. When did you realize, or how did you realize the power of stories? What was that moment that led to this book, the new book, and everything else that you're kind of like the keynote speaking? Clearly, everything is tied around stories. What was the moment you realized how important that they are?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure there was a single moment, but I can tell you the general period of time was probably after 15 years of my career. I'd spent a couple of years with as a consultant for Anderson, and then 20 years at Procter and Gamble, and it was probably 15 years into my P&G career when it finally dawned on me that the leaders that I admired the most and wanted to work for and wanted to be like when I grew up in the company had this amazing skill of being able to tell fabulous stories. And I thought, they didn't teach me that in business school. They didn't teach me that when I joined the company. It's not been on any of my skill development, needs assessment from the, HR department or anything. And that made me realize I want to go learn that skill, but it was hard to do because you don't find classes on them or enough books written about them. And so that's what led me down the path to write the first book there. You got there, Lead with a Story. And then that got me down the path of thinking about applying storytelling to other venues of life. So the second book is Parenting with a Story. The most recent book is Sell with a Story. And I can see various others into the future. But yeah, it started about the 15-year mark into P&G.
Amazing stuff. Well, for everyone who wants to know more about you, for anyone who wants to accelerate this process rather than having to listen to the show and perhaps doing a lot more of the work and researching themselves, tell us a little bit about the keynote speaking, the training, and then you mentioned it then, so tell us where we can find the latest book as well.
So the books are probably all online wherever you buy books from Amazon or Barnes & Noble or whatever, and you can get them at my website, which is leadwithastory.com. And there you can probably find out about most of the stuff that I'm doing because as I was mentioned to you before the show, I probably spend 75% of my time researching and writing the next book that I'm working on. But my primary business model is actually keynote speeches, half-day, full-day training courses for either executives or sales teams in teaching them the art and the science of how to leverage storytelling to make them a better leader or a better salesperson, et cetera. And because what I'm finding is, a lot of people are like, well, that's great, but I don't have 6 weeks to read your book. I've got an afternoon next month on a Thursday. That's what I've got. So, and I got a whole team to get through this. So you come out here and spend a half a day or a day with us and teach us everything you know. And so mostly what I've done is developed full, training courses around these concepts to teach people in a short amount of time.
Amazing stuff. Well, I'll link to all of that in the show notes to this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com. And with that, Paul, I want to thank you for your time. I'm looking forward to having you back on to dive into this further. And I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It was my pleasure.